Aloha mai kako. This is the second lecture for our unit on Kamehameha and politics of education in Hawaii. Um, Let me share screen here, and then we'll get into talking about a little bit broader context in the last lecture, which really focused on Kamehameha, its sort of trajectory over time, and the scope of operations today, sort of just setting the stage for talking about the SFFA case, but there's certainly lots more as well as our discussion in the first week of this unit got us to really talk about a larger context of sorry, I think that's better. Um, a larger context of like solving these difficult problems of doing Hawaiian education that serves Alahui Hawaii, nurtures Alahui Hawaii in the context of US occupation, which is obviously quite difficult. Um, and yet it's an area where so much energy, movement energy has been put into because in part, I think our movement has for a long time been very committed to nonviolence and also one that thinks deeply about a long-term future horizon where education is one way to sort of create the futures that people hope to see. And also because I think there is a long um, genealogy of just appreciation and thirst for knowledge and excellence in the pursuit of and stewarding of knowledge over, generations. And so the entry of schooling into that larger context of Hawaiian education and knowledge production is one that is clearly more recent and also introduces a number of different kinds of political angles that could be discussed. And so this presentation is really to think with you about this genealogy of schools in Hawaii and also of really starting from the assumption and the understanding that schooling is not the same as education. There's obviously overlap, but a lot of times when we live in a society where schools are the dominant educational institutions, we kind of think when someone says education, that's what we're always talking about. So just starting there. And like all genealogies, like all mo'oku au how this one is situated, it is partial. It's not a comprehensive overview but rather it's part of a story. And before we go on this brief journey into the past, and then bring us back to the future or the present and casting our eyes forward to the future or backward to the future, I wanted you to think about your own genealogy and experiences in relation to schools. I know there are some of you in the class who are Kamehameha graduates like myself, or have affiliations with schools with which you have maybe a contentious or mixed relationship, or have mixed feelings about. Um, but also considering when we think about those genealogies of our own educations, what are the kuleana that we carry because of the knowledge and relationships with which we've been entrusted. And I always like to start this presentation, which Kalamai, if you've heard it before, I've done it many times in different iterations, but I always like to start it with this quote that I found so powerful when Dr. Angela Davis, who was one of my teachers in graduate school, um, sort of really imprinted on us. And I think other teachers as well have imprinted this on us. But part of my educational genealogy has been this understanding that histories inhabit us and we inhabit those histories, even when we're not aware of our relationship to these histories. And when I've given this presentation to folks who work within the DOE or public education like public charter schools. Um, that's probably where I've done this presentation the most often. Almost across the board, people are quite unaware of the history of the public education system in Hawaii. And so hopefully that is changing as the College of Ed is also changing. But important to understand the histories of these institutions that we inhabit. And so the major sort of takeaway for me, as I indicated in our first week when we were talking about Kamehameha, is that I think it's absolutely essential to think about the public K through 12 schooling system in Hawaii as part of the Hawaiian national legacy that was illegally seized. So governance over that system was, illegally seized. And certainly eroded prior to 1893 and of course then 1898, but even, going back to 1887 with the Bennett Constitution period, the so-called Constitution. So critical to understand that the public school system was built during the Hawaiian Kingdom under the laws of a native-led government, and that in the entire time that schools have been an institution of learning, of education in Hawaii, Kanaka Maoli have made up the majority of the teachers throughout that time period before US occupation. And that said, it's not like there's this romantic picture of it's monolithic. Obviously, schools have always been places of political contention and full of power relations and struggles over what should be done in them. And that is certainly the case throughout this whole trajectory of the first schools that appear in the islands and are set up alongside churches and then also as seminaries to train preachers and teachers and, statesmen, as they say. And then the public school system gets created concurrently with the transition to a constitutional monarchy. And it's really part of this self-modernization process. We'll go through sort of some of these trends over time through the presentation, but I'll point out here that this mid to late 1800s part coincides with when Kamehameha is founded. So Kamehameha is founded when these pedagogies and philosophical approaches to schooling was, sort of in the air here in Hawaii. And then, of course, the other thing that I'll talk a little bit about is how language plays into this picture as well. And of course, this is Mahina Olelo Hawaii, so awesome for us to be thinking about this. And I really invite, as we'll set up some conversation in the coming weeks, either over Zoom or online, those of you who have deep knowledge about some of the histories that I'm going to be covering in this, to please share, please correct me, let's engage in conversation. So starting out is just the basic question of what happened to this national legacy and what have been the impacts of that illegal seizure. We often talk about how the illegal seizure of these national lands, the corpus of national lands, has played into the negative, social conditions for Kanaka, led to has played a factor in dispossession. But what are the impacts of these schooling systems, and how do you and any of the schools that you might be connected with inhabit that history? How do these histories inhabit you? So a few of these questions might be kind of basic for some of you, but as I mentioned, there are really these dominant narratives about schools and literacy that are around and that shape the way we think about why there is substantial educational inequality in the school system today, public school system in Hawaii today. Where it's sort of the major narrative is that, well, these things were imposed upon Hawaiians and they're culturally mismatched, and the Hawaiians just weren't made for this. Um, so when we look at who taught Kanaka to read, invariably, every time I give this presentation, I ask this question, and people always say the missionaries taught Kanaka how to read. And when we think about that, certainly Kanaka, certainly the Calvinist missionaries who arrived in Hawaii in the early 1820s had a role. But really, when you look at the teachers of who contributed directly to the massive increase in literacy of this kind, print literacy, it was really Kanaka who were teaching other Kanaka how to read. So at the early heights of enrollments, when schools were not mandatory, right, there are places to gather, to transmit knowledge, but there weren't school laws that required all kids to be in school from this age to this age, as there are now. So in those early heights of enrollment in the early 1800s, there were 900 to 1100 schools, which is more than there are today. This is an old statistic, sorry. And in total, the ABCFM, the American Board of Commissions for Foreign Missionaries, sent only 150 missionaries, and majority of them came after 1831. So we know that in the vast majority of these schools, it wasn't like a white person at the front teaching a bunch of brown-skinned Kanaka how to read, which is kind of the image that I think a lot of people have. But really, it was these technologies had been, introduced to Hawaii and then massively disseminated primarily from one Hawaiian to another. And the two presses that were around at the time were staffed largely by Kanaka. Now, Noinoi Silva and others have, but especially Noinoi Silva have had a lot to say to like complicate the politics of these presses and the role that they played. So I'm not going to get too deep into that, other than to say that because of that work, we have this massive archive in Olelo, Hawaii that we're so fortunate to have. And you couldn't talk about the history of schools in Hawaii without talking about Lahaina Luna, which is one of the very first seminaries to be set up, and deeply connected with the project of a national project of training Hawaiian men as teachers and preachers for an expanding Christian church, but also at the same time for this national project of training political leaders. And the photo here or image of Ha'alilio is, he's such an amazing example of that graduate of Lahaina Luna, class of 1835. He is the one that leads the mission, the diplomatic mission that secures recognition from France and the UK about, and the US about Hawaiian independence. And so it was in many ways these early Lahaina Luna graduates that were laying a blueprint for other Kanaka Aloha Aina who crossed over. Like a lot of times today we think of teachers as just that's their job. They just work in schools. But in the way that we might think in the university of scholars and intellectuals as people who are teaching, who are doing research, who are publishing, and perhaps who are even getting involved in positions of governing authority. So of course, the ABS-CFM coming from this very patriarchal and white supremacist, although liberal culture and tradition, start to educate men, right, as in the mirror of their sort of patriarchy. And by the middle of the 1800s, this concern arises for educating more Native girls. Now, there was also education happening for ali'i wahine, but girls more broadly. Um, and this is sort of critical because wahine were being scapegoated by missionary educators as transmitters of disease and were being held responsible by some, not all missionaries, broadly written, but this isn't a presentation about missionaries. This is really a presentation about schooling. And so that was certainly a trend that was happening. And so these seminaries for girls began, and later what you see kind of mirrored in the school for girls at Kamehameha is a very similar kind of thing of sort of educating girls to be not only prepared to be homemakers in what we might now think of as a bourgeois or middle class sense, but also in practicing a heteropatriarchal form of the family, the nuclear family, that others have pointed out was really part of this project of what some might call colonization, but as my article that you'll read points out, or what I call it is domestication. Um, the other sort of question when I give this presentations to groups in the public school system K through 12 level is who led the development of Hawaii's public schools in the 1800s. A lot of times there's this narrative that schooling was imposed on Hawaiians with no agency. And what we actually see is that in those, right from the very beginning of the institution of public schooling under the kingdom, Kanaka were working and leading at all levels of the system, the national level, the regional or mokupuni level, and the more local level. And that tracks, right? Because like population wise as well, Kanaka were the majority of the population. But it is to say that it's worth pointing this out because this often gets, that Kanaka agency is often overlooked as it is in so many other kind of realms of political life. So as I mentioned, the beginning of the launching of a public school system coincides and is a part of a self-modernization and hybridization process of bringing the Hawaiian kingdom into an era of constitutional monarchy. And oh, sorry, you can't see that too well. I don't know why it's off center here, but hopefully you can see the whole thing. These are, you know, in that earlier kind of slide that I had about at all the different levels. So these also are, at the national superintendent level, and then at the mokupuni level, and then at the local school board level, you see like the names here of people who were put in charge, right? Okay. So the national and mokupuni level, in many ways, sort of similar to what we think of now as superintendent today, and the complex areas of the existing system. But what was quite different was the way that local school boards were empowered. So now there is a single board of education aside from the charter schools that each have their own local school boards. But in the kingdom era, local school boards was a widespread form of more decentralized governance. So as a snapshot example, in 1852, there were 535 public schools, all under the control of the parents interested. They were taught by Hawaiians, mostly in Hawaiian, serving 15,000 plus students. And those local school boards had powers around budget, around the hiring and firing of kumu, around building and maintaining their hale. And of course, there were taxes that were instituted to fund these local schools. And it was the families and communities who were engaged to ensure attendance for youth between 4 and 14 years. I always like to share as well how they were not just sort of doing these more bureaucratic administrative tasks, but it was really embedded within this idea of a community school, a local community school, where they were also organizing haumana and other folks in their kaiaulu to grow food, to feed these kumu. And, teachers today like that. They like to hear that. Wow, we were being fed. They were also gathering, and other Hawaiian scholars have written about the many ways that Kanaka of this era were exchanging knowledge and our esteemed and beloved Noe Silva actually shared this with me, that she had been looking at an instance of a 4-day-long teacher meeting in Hilo that is described as kumu sharing knowledge, but especially about various mo'olelo Hawaii. And other scholars, as I mentioned, have done more work on this than I have, since a lot of this work that I'm presenting came out of like when I was still doing dissertation and book research for my first book. And they were encouraging each other to teach mo'olelo in schools. And so we know that they were not only kind of there repeating a curriculum that had been imported from outside, but they were really thinking about these places as vibrant spaces of knowledge transmission. And in the same way that the newspapers reflect like a political struggle and different kinds of approaches to thinking about the national project and its relationship to foreign influences, those who wanted to wrest power from Kanaka. Schools similarly, were places where grounds of contention. But what we can see from examples like this is that that there was a lot of Kanaka agency happening around how can we make these institutions of education our own. And when we think about this question of who really catalyzed public education in Hawaii and made it really kind of crystallize and formalize the kinds of things that we think about when we think about public schooling, oftentimes in dominant histories of, the historiography of education in Hawaii, schools in Hawaii, this dude, Richard Armstrong, is often cited and completely overlooked because most of the folks who had written about that history in the past were only consulting English language sources. Completely overlooked in many of these has been the role that Mateo Kekuanao'a played. And Kekuanao'a was head of public education in the Hawaiian Kingdom from 1860 to 1868. And if we can lean on Noe Silva's analysis, the 1860s were in some way sort of amazing golden era of flourishing of Hawaiian agency and knowledge production, and a really taking control of some of these introduced technologies like the presses fully into Kanaka hands. And I think we see this sort of mirrored also in the public education system in Hawaii. So Kekuanao'a proposed that the National Board of Education match funds for local districts who are wanting to build and renovate schoolhouses to really improve the facilities for education that was happening in schools. He urged appropriation for additional funds from the legislature, since one of the things that was happening was that if the local districts were only relying on their own tax base at the local level, they were having to, cut back the number of days that the school was open. So in the same way that today we hear folks talk about the importance of this single board system as helping to and not relying on a property tax kind of a system to fund public schools. It creates more equality or equity across the system. That's really what Mateo Kekuanao'a was advocating for back under his leadership of the system. And he wanted teachers not to be chosen for their denominational character because schools had, since their first introduction, a few decades before, been very much associated with a particular church or denomination. So when you look at, and this is the English, but it would be great also to look at the Olala Hawaii version for those of you that have that capacity. He What you can see is that that was something that he clearly advocated for, right? Was this separation of church and state. And so people think about that very much as an American kind of import. But you can clearly see that in 1860, which was not a time in which the US was exerting power over Hawaiian Kingdom government, that the common schools should be regarded as strictly neutral ground in religious matters. So that was something that was seen as part of the national project from a Kanaka leader perspective. But the other thing that begins to happen in Hawaii in this late 60s and certainly into the 70s and 80s was the growth of the sugar industry, and this industry becoming one that was very much dependent on a racially hierarchical society and way of approaching, developing that industry here in Hawaii, such that the owners and financiers were predominantly Haole, not exclusively, but predominantly um, oh, oops. The plantation laborers, a mix, Kanaka, later Chinese, later Japanese, later Portuguese and Filipino. The ditch engineers were often, so the ditch engineers that were bringing water out of the natural watersheds into the areas where sugar was grown, often haole, and the laborers who were doing the very dangerous work of building these ditches, primarily Asian, especially Japanese, but also some Kanaka. And so into this era of the rise of the sugar industry in Hawaii, you have a moment when Charles Reed Bishop, who's the husband of Hawaii, who we talked about in the last lecture, was president of the board of education. And what you see happening during this period is a pullback from the direction that Kekuanao'a had been leading that system. And so Bishop was an interesting person, and people have different thoughts about him. But one thing that we can just say from a factual perspective is that he opened a bank that became what is now First Hawaiian Bank, and it held a 26-year monopoly over banking during this height of the sugar industry's rise. And he became incredibly wealthy because of that. And also, obviously, his interests very much tied to the growth of that industry. So while you're leading the public education system to also be personally benefiting from the whole finance structure of that industry is clearly, uh, conflicts of interest today. Although it's also certainly the case still that many, bankers and other business folks are in positions of leadership in the board of education. Um, so he is appointed to the board from 1969 onward. What you see at the top is sort of, oh no, maybe I didn't organize it that way. Anyway, what you see in this timeline is sort of both kind of major points in his roles in education, in schooling in Hawaii, the governance of schools and the school system, along with what was happening with the sugar industry and his businesses there. Um, so beginning in 1874, agricultural and industrial training was incorporated into the common schools, which, by that point, there's this developing system between the common and select schools, where the common schools were seen as it sounds like, for the common people were primarily in Hawaiian. The select schools were seen as for a developing elite in this kind of hierarchical society. And this is a quote that comes from one of Charles Reed Bishop's reports to the Kingdom Legislature in his role as head of the public school system. So he says the rising generation of Hawaiians are not as industrious as their ancestors were, that they, and especially those educated in higher schools and in English, have the wrong ideas about labor. They're, in short, lazy and idle. And you have heard, I'm sure, this sort of narrative before, that when there's an industry for which there is a need for folks who will do hard labor for long hours and little pay, there is an attack on any sort of educational pathways that would take them into other sort of opportunity structures where they would say, like, I'm not really that interested in working in the sugarcane fields. So again, direct connections between his own financial interests and his, sorry for the funny transition there. So then what you see happening is a very different, whereas I was saying that Kekuana'o was really arguing for a more equitable funding structure for public schools. What you see Bishop under his administration or his leadership of this system is that there's actually a growing disparity between the common and select schools. So again, these are just sort of two snapshots, but really important moments because they mark the sort of exponential growth of sugar following the Treaty of Reciprocity. So the select schools in blue, again, a smaller number of students. The red is the common schools, and this is just an absolute number of funding. You can see here, even though there were more students in the common schools, the funding for the select schools is higher. And my thesis that I would submit to you all and to others is that this is really the beginning of what we see still today as this narrative that public schools are not as good as private schools. And there was a deep material disparity that begins to grow at this time that is sustained and has, had ups and downs over time, but the general trend has sustained. And what you also see growing exponentially at this time is the strength of a white supremacist faction and elite who are part of that industry, right? And when I talk about white supremacy, I'm talking not only about this ideological belief structure that those who are marked white are better than others, but also the institutions, the infrastructure that are built around that belief, whether it is coded or whether it is just said explicitly right out loud. And then the other aspects of that white supremacist system of power then are the economic pillars, the legal, the laws, and judicial decisions that enable and mask white privilege, or that help for more privilege and wealth to accrue to certain groups and not others. And then, a growing monopoly on the means of violence. So for instance, in this period, the growing numbers of the Honolulu Rifles, that is the militia, which later participates in the coup against Liliuokalani. And so they really entrench this racial hierarchy. And for me, the analogy between the school systems and the ditch systems that they were interested in building throughout this period is a powerful one for thinking about how material resources were taken out of lands that had been in Kanaka, Oiwi agricultural production, and all of the knowledge systems that supported the feeding of communities by those communities themselves or in partnership with their neighboring communities, with these water systems that literally took that water into the drier, arid, flatter areas where sugar was grown largely for export, well, almost solely for export. So I like to think about school systems that were being changed similarly to these ditch systems. And then, of course, there's sort of the way I see it is this ascension of this white supremacist elite to formal control of governing levers of power when they execute the bayonet coup in 1887. And then they begin to seek US annexation. And you see that mirrored in the Board of Education's composition under their governance. And yet you still see throughout this time leading up to 1893 that Hawaiian legislators, where there are still substantial representation and power as far as the formal kind of bodies of government in the kingdom, is that there were legislators who were really concerned about the discrepancy between teachers who were teaching in English medium schools and in Hawaiian medium schools, between salaries. There was a listing that was called for by some of the legislators at this time that showed that foreign teachers were being paid 6 to 10 times more than kumu who are Kanaka Maoli. And they were asking for an explanation of why are school teachers being sought from outside the islands, and why aren't we cultivating teachers from right here in Hawaii and compensating them fairly? And I mean, this is to this day, right, a sort of tale as old as time. But again, these narratives and problems, material problems that the narratives reflect are, have these historical roots. And that's what we mean when we talk about histories inhabiting us, even when we're not aware of our relationships to them. And there's this struggle over language that continues. In 1884, if you look at courses at Lahaina Luna Seminary and Hilo boarding school, which, has its own problems, but we're not going to talk about that too much right here. But make that as a note, which were training native teachers. These courses began to shift toward English, and this worsened the shortage of teachers who could teach Makolalo Hawaii in the common schools. And by 1896, when this minority white supremacist oligarchy wrests control of the government illegally from the Liliuokalani and installs themselves as a so-called Republic of Hawaii. They were not democratic or liberal in any way. Passed a law that made English the sole language in Hawaii schools, and that stood until the 1980s. So really, when we think about this break in Hawaiian self-governance that happens in 1893, again, rightfully so, we have focused a whole lot of our movement energies on lands and pointing out the illegal seizure of lands. It's absolutely critical also to point out the usurpation of the Hawaiian national public education system, which is, in my mind, as valuable, if not more so, than any other institution, at least within the government structure, because it is about shaping the consciousness of the current and future generations. And they had this fundamental challenge, right? They were trying to figure out, how do we maintain power when we know that we are vastly outnumbered? And it was a very small white minority who were trying to wield power over a large majority people of color and indigenous people in the population, but also folks who would be considered white who were not aligned with the oligarchy and who were quite critical. So high schools really begin to take off after the the overthrow, the so-called overthrow, so-called annexation. And you see this massive growth, right, from small numbers in 1900 as high schools are first beginning to get off the ground. So not just 4 to 14, but now you're right to what we think of today as the ending point for secondary schools to 17, 18. And even though there's this huge growth, the budget increase doesn't follow that. And you can see why, from an economic point of view, the people who are holding power, these are Republican elites during this territorial era, why it's not important for them to invest in public schools, because they just need these mass majority of folks to be educated just enough to work in the plantations and not too much to question the fact that, wow, we are in the vast majority over the small minority. So of course there's resistance, massive labor organizing that happens during this period, amazing things. But in general, keeping their attempt to keep, population relatively minimally, schooled was better for the plantation elites. And there's a whole lot of other things that we could talk about during that period. And Derek Tyra, some of folks have taken his classes. There's the whole introduction of the English standard system, which becomes a way to create hierarchy even within the public schools, and is a way to also mark differences in class and level of assimilation as well. There's a whole lot that we could talk about there. But I thought, coming back to Kamehameha, I wanted to point out also that through this period, where everything I just described is happening in public schools, one of the major thing that's happening at Kamehameha is an intense militarization of the school, which was not the case from the AT. There was always some level of military discipline that was inculcated in students, but Kamehameha becomes a military academy formally affiliated with the US military in the first decade of the 1900s, in the very first introduction of ROTC programs by the US, all the way through these pictures, which I'll tell you a little bit about, come from the 1960s, late 1960s, and all the way through to the 90s, until Kamehameha finally makes this decision. The leaders at that time made the decision in the early 2000s to cut that relationship because that was a form of federal funding. So there were actually commissioned officers who taught at Kamehameha, US military commissioned officers who taught at Kamehameha in the ROTC program, and at times in other capacities. And it was very much, again, a way of training students in sort of an American patriarchal and militarized culture where the young men would have to wear uniforms, they would have to be ironed, the shoes would have to be polished, they would get demerits for being out of uniform, even to the late 1960s, and that's where this picture comes from. The boys would be inspected every single day. So they would come early in the morning, show up and line up, and they would be inspected for their uniform and given demerits if they were late or if they were in some way out of uniform. Now so that wasn't the case for the Wahine, but the corollary to it was that the officers of the various companies, so these are students who become officers in the hierarchy of the military training among students, were sort of given the privilege of having sponsors. And these sponsors were these beautiful young women who were chosen from among sort of like the young women who were, high achievers, and were considered to represent, the brains, beauty, and vivacity of what good and industrious young women were meant to be. And so you might see in this photo, if you've been looking at it, someone who looks familiar, or maybe you can see her name, but the third young woman from the left is Kumuhaunani Trask. And side note, the third woman from the right is my mother-in-law, Emerald Waine'e, now Winchester. So this was seen as like a privilege, right, for these and a reward for these officers and for young men, students, and for these young women. It was seen as like a badge of honor. The other picture that you see is the text of the graduation address by the Lieutenant General, who was of what we would now think of as RIMPAC in Hawaii, sort of the commanding officer for the US Marine Corps here, was asked to give the graduation speech at their class, the girls that you see here, their class senior year graduation. So by that point, the school had just been merged to co-ed. Prior in their early years in high school, this class, they had a girls' school and a boys' school, but during I think it was their sophomore year, the schools were merged, so it was a co-ed school. So their graduation of the co-ed class of 1967 is an address by this Lieutenant General. It's in the mix of the Vietnam War. There is lots of social unrest about the war at this time. And the primary message that is given to students is that you're going to hear people say, be a leader, be a leader. No, what we need now, what our country, the US, needs now is not a lack of leaders. What we are lacking is followers. And so this entire speech, and it's lengthy, is going to be about how to be a good follower. It's all about followership, which I didn't even know was a word until I read this speech. But it was so striking to me, especially as we think about how one of the goals of Kamehameha today is to nurture OEV leaders, and whatever criticisms there might be of that goal, there it is quite a contrast to this message. The first of which is be obedient. And he very much weaves in, the war into the speech. And by this point, their own classmates are going off to war. Okay, so that is just a little snapshot, bringing it back to Kamehameha. In this bottom photo, you see a grown Haunani-Kay Trask in 1993, and you all know the story of the Onipa'a March. But really, these movements of Aloha Aina and Ea of that time really put quite a bit of energy into schooling and what is the power that schools as institutions can do to not only make a better life for individual Hawaiians, but can uplift a collective consciousness, and elevate like our understanding of our political history and the capacities to envision and guide a self-determined future. And this comes out of a response to what the reports that we're looking at, both health status and educational status of Native Hawaiians at the time, were showing, which was that Kanaka Maoli had highest rates of family poverty, incarceration, academic underachievement measured by, Western tests and whatnot, but also just various negative health indicators for youth. There's a survey called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which really is looking at like self-perception and self-reported rates of all kinds of things, including things like suicide, depression, substance abuse, or substance use in the school environment, fighting in schools, feeling safe in schools. And Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students, like rates are just vastly unequal from others. And when you look at kind of the overall trend is that even though there has been quite a lot of work done following, for example, the Native Hawaiian Education Act that we talked about, this federal funding stream that infuses different programs in Hawaiian language and culture and has provided tremendous benefits in terms of the revitalization of Hawaiian knowledge in many, many ways, and has helped and changed the lives of many, many people. Overall, when you look at the wider social picture of social inequality, we see that these rates have remained largely unchanged and in some areas have worsened. And this is what led me to sort of the conclusion when I was doing my dissertation and then writing my first book, was that these inequities, these educational inequities, schooling inequities, are not going to be addressed unless we also address the bigger problem of government and political sovereignty. So that said, one of the things that happens even within the settler state context is that the movements that come out of the 1960s and through the 70s result in a large number of a Native Hawaiian caucus at the 1978 Constitutional Convention. And among the things that this caucus is able to push through is Article 10 of the Hawaii State Constitution, which says the state shall promote the study of Hawaiian culture, history, and language, and provide for a Hawaiian education program consisting of language, culture, and history. And as we know, the term shall is really important because it is a kawoha, um, you shall do this. So following alongside that timeline, there are grassroots efforts to get these schools off the ground, because even when the state has this mandate in its own constitution, it takes political will and movement and action for programs to get off the ground and to demand support for them. So it's in 1983, right at the same time as those early reports looking at Hawaiian education and health status are happening, that a grassroots group of Hawaiian language educators establishes the Aha Punana Leo, dedicated to reviving Olala Hawaii, focusing first on the preschool level. And the first Punana Leo preschool opens then in Kauai on the west side, close to Ni'ihau, in 1984, followed by Punana Leo throughout the islands over the next couple of decades. And then because of a lot of the advocacy that was happening around those schools and the just amazing educators who were trying to do the work of teaching and running schools and developing curriculum, and they were also advocating at the same time, at the legislature, there's finally a removal of that ban, that law banning teaching Hawaiian in public schools. So harmonizing with the Constitution. And then following that, the very first elementary Hawaiian immersion classes begin in K through 12 public schools. Kula Kaiapuni open at Keaukaha and at Waiau. And this photo is a photo of all of the Keiki Kaiapuni on Oahu at the Capitol. I think this was from the 125th anniversary of 1893. And then the other thing that kind of comes out of this movement, but is a little bit of a branch off of it, is the Hawaiian charter schools that really emerge at the end of the 20th century and going into the 21st. This is sort of like, I think of them as the mom and dad of Hawaiian charter schools, Ku and Alei Kakalau. They were educators working in Honoka'a and running a school within a school at the time in Honoka'a, in the public high school there. And they became advocates of startup charter schools. There had already been conversion charter schools here in Hawaii that were predominantly in affluent, predominantly white and Asian areas. And so they, on their own time, their own budgets, went from community, island to island to say, hey, this law has opened up a window for 25 startup charter schools, and we want Hawaiian communities to get in the door and to start schools. And so this photo comes from a panel, as they were on that tour, the panel that they did at Kamakakuokalani in 1999. And I happened to be there. I had just come back from my first year of graduate school in California and was home for the summer. And this was how I spent my very first day back at home, was just sitting on the, I think it was carpet. I feel like we were sitting on that. No, maybe there were chairs. Anyway, listening to them talk about the amazing work that they had been doing, and this opportunity was there, and that they were willing to support groups that were interested in starting up charter schools. And a couple of us stayed afterward to talk with them and thought, oh, this would be something really cool to do when we're 30 or 40, not when we're 25. but they were like, you got to do it now. This is a window, and after this window, we don't know when there will be this many spaces, if any. So they were amazing in helping to support many schools, including the schools on Oahu that started with that first wave, such as Halau Kumana and Halau Zakahi, um, Hakipu'u Learning Ohana Learning Center. Um, so one of the things that I highlighted here from Kukakalau's dissertation, which is totally worth reading if you're interested in the politics of Hawaiian education, is that she talks about how it was really critically important for the employees at public charter schools to be state employees with union wages and full benefits that were guaranteed under the union. And that was critical because in other places where in the US where charter schools were rolled out, one of the goals of for-profit charter school operators was to, have a way around public sector unions. And from the beginning, all of the Hawaiian charter school operators, um, had felt it was critically important for teachers to have equitable pay pegged to the same scale as their mainstream DOE counterparts. So just something I wanted to highlight there. And in some ways, to me, it like echoes some of the things that were important to Ke Kuanaoa. This was considered to be a moderate charter school law in comparison with in other, in states of the United States, like I mentioned, where the charter school law was really kind of pushed by either the right or by people who really support a privatization of the public school system. So here, a cap on the number of charter schools, a single authorizing authority, and then the opportunity to negotiate. They had to collectively bargain with the union, but they could create their own sort of addendums to or separate agreements, supplemental agreements to the HSTA, for example, collective bargaining agreement. And then the other major thing that takes place though is that there's no funding for capital improvements and facilities. And so this kind of is an ongoing issue for charter schools operating today. And so, I was super fortunate myself to be involved with a group that started Halau Kumana. This is the group of our students who were the very first students. Fifth grade was our youngest. We had one student in fifth grade, all the way up to juniors. And every time I see this picture, I just, smile because I think about all of these amazing families who entrusted an ambitious and untested set of young educators, like myself and my other colleagues who were part of this venture into schooling with their kids, which was just such a tremendous privilege. I need to pause for 1 second, both because I'm tearing up, but also because my battery is low. I need to plug in. But one of the things that I remember most about this time was the real hopefulness that there could be something different. For these kids and families who had felt like the system had very much abandoned them or was actively doing harm to them, the public school system. Sorry. And so I say that not to in any way malign the amazing work that many public school teachers and administrators do in the DOE system, but certainly there were have been and perhaps still are both structures and individuals who, actively perpetuated processes of domestication and Americanization and just straight up harm. Um, so this was also something that I thought a lot about as very much in hand with that idea of reclaiming the waters, reclaiming the pathways for waters, knowledge, relationships, aloha to flow. Yeah, I'm not going to say too much about that. But what we were able to grow over time was just really an amazing kind of realization that there could be power, just as I'm sure that the early leaders of Ahapunana Leo and other Hawaiian educational initiatives have found, like, there's tremendous challenge, but also tremendous hope and power in what can be created when we recenter the practices and the mo'olelo and the community relationships and the aina, that you kind of see pictured here. So whereas on the US continent, it's sort of always been like, these are schools of choice, these are schools of choice. Hawaiian charter schools were never just about choice. They were primarily about kuleana. And they had been from the start, Kanaka-led, Aina-based, culture-driven, very different in approaches across the spectrum of Hawaiian culture-based charter schools, but very much committed to similar kinds of core principles. And then finally, to kind of like close this part of focusing on the public education system, I wanted to point out the really important Hawaii State Supreme Court decision that was issued in 2019, the Clarabelle versus DOE BOE case, in which Kanaka Maoli mom on Lanai had her children in Kaiapuni schools on Maui. And when they moved to Lanai, there was no access. And they were told at first that it was, well, that's just, there's not a demand, so there's not access. And we are not compelled to provide that access to you because there's not enough people. And the decision from the Supreme Court was quite clear that the wording in the Constitution, the state's Constitution, requires the state to institute a program that is reasonably calculated to revive the native Hawaiian language, to revive the Hawaiian language. It acknowledged the substantial role that Hawaiian language has played in Hawaiian society. It criticized the impact of colonialism, which sought to impose English as the medium of education, the medium of communication, by using schools to eliminate Hawaiian language, public schools. And it clarified that this is a mandate. This is a constitutional mandate to provide access to Hawaiian language immersion education. And that's huge. And yet it has still been a fight. I have to say, I have a very good friend who fought and fought and fought to have a Kula Kaiapuni started at Kapolei. Her son was at Waiau in his early years, and there was no option for a Kula Kaiapuni in Ewa. and all of the students that attend Kayapuni K through 12 were being within the mainstream DOE system. And when I say that, I include the Kayapuni schools, not a charter school. Had to, drive to bus it to Palolo to Anoinoi, which is a fabulous school that my kids attended, but difficult as far as access, right? So she engaged the Native Hawaiian Legal Corp to represent their parent hui to press the DOE to open a Kayapuni program at Kapolei. So even though there is this recognized constitutional mandate, there's still very much a need to have the political will and pressure and just like the dogged determination to make it happen from a parent and community standpoint to demand change in the system. And so I'll end this presentation that kind of gives us this little bit wider view of the politics of Native Hawaiian education or schooling in Hawaii in relation to Native Hawaiian politics. With this quote from Sandy Grand in her book, Red Pedagogy, where she says that unless educational reform happens concurrently with analyses of the forces of colonialism, it can only serve as a deeply insufficient, if not negligent, band-aid over the incessant wounds of imperialism. And I think that is a great way to hopefully leave you with some energy and charge to get out there and reclaim the Hawaiian national legacy of our national public school system. Whether it is within that pressuring of the settler state to follow its own constitutional mandate, or to create opportunities for bringing some form of autonomous governance to publicly funded schooling. So mahalo nui for hanging with me and listening, and I look forward to seeing you folks on Zoom and conversations that we'll have online as well. Aloha, hui hou.